Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. When the U.S. president ripped up the North American Free Trade Agreement, he replaced it with a deal that can be renegotiated halfway through its term. In the lead up to the 2026 review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement, negotiators who penned that initial deal have teamed up. Meet the Coalition for North American Trade. Kenneth Smith Ramos is Mexico's former chief trade negotiator. Kevin Brady is a former chair of the U.S. House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee. And Steve Vergule is Canada's former chief trade negotiator. They join us now. Thank you for joining us.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
So first of all, maybe Steve, we'll start with you on the home court advantage. Why to launch a coalition?
Well, I think the three of us each had firsthand knowledge of the benefits of an integrated North American economy. We realized that was going to come under some pressure from the U.S. going forward, and we wanted to rally as much support as we could to provide an alternative view. And we've been operating under an integrated economy for more than 30 years now and did not want to see that start to unravel. So a lot of business interests that we wanted to capture in advance.
So you guys decided to get the band back together?
Yeah. That's correct.
All right. So, Kevin, let me put this to you. How do you negotiate with someone who cannot be trusted to abide by their own trade deals?
So a couple thoughts here. One, I think to the first question about the coalition, I've worked on in Congress 13 of America's 15 free trade agreements, including USMCA. Ways and Means heads the trade portion in the House of Representatives and in Congress as well. And this is easily the most consequential trade pact on the planet, key to America. Americans of all consumers, small businesses, agriculture, technology, manufacturing. And it seemed to us this time, the landscape would be more challenging. And in the past, where each country sort of created a set of cheerleaders within their country to lay out the case for this agreement. In this case, we believe to supplement that, we need a three-nation effort where we are working together, ag, business, technology, manufacturing, small business together, sharing stories, sharing intel, sharing our advocacy efforts. And to your question, there's no question President Trump, since the 80s has been focused on trade deficits and what he believes is unfair trade practices. He doesn't believe other countries play by the rules, specifically China. And so to some extent, I don't think he feels the need to play by the rules himself, although clearly he believes USMCA, the new trade agreement, is modernized, is stronger, works to America's benefit even more so. And he's made clear, he is not withdrawing from this agreement. But as you know, the actions that have been taken here in the second term, where in the past tariffs were really focused on trade issues, now they run the gamut. Border security, fentanyl, pressure on China, pressure on Iran, buying more U.S. energy, critical mineral supplies, all those issues. He is using tariffs to leverage those conversations, bring people to the table. And so it creates challenges for Canada and Mexico, who is very focused, as we have in the past, on this rule-based trading system, on this agreement that has worked so well for us. So yeah, it is these framework agreements we're seeing today, Michael, are much different in the past. What we're seeing really are sort of the handshake deals, with details to be worked out later. But to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the big concern is, what does this mean for us in our zero tariff policy for so many of our goods, our exemptions from steel and aluminum tariffs, all of which have allowed each of the three countries to compete and win better because, frankly, we are just stronger together.
Kenneth, do you buy the idea that if you renegotiate CUSMA, USMCA, what you call it, that it'll actually be a deal that will be honored?
Well, I mean, what we learned from the first negotiation of the USMCA is that, indeed, if there is the possibility of negotiating an agreement with the United States that preserves free trade, we should definitely give it a shot. I think should be a priority for Mexico, for Canada. We had a situation in the first negotiation of the agreement where the U.S. Trade policy was very aggressive. They were also looking to utilize tariffs, as they did on steel and aluminum, to generate protection for U.S. industries, arguing national security interests, etc. But at the end of the day, by sticking to our principles, which was to maintain and preserve free trade and strengthen the trade agreement that had worked very well for 25 years and needed to be upgraded, we found the space, both technically and politically, to negotiate with the United States. Despite their very negative attitude versus the NAFTA, we were able to reach a positive agreement that's balanced for all three countries and to preserve free trade. In this review that's upcoming in 2026, as you know, it is not an automatic renegotiation. The text states that the countries will analyze how the agreement is being implemented, and they can make recommendations as how to improve its operation. But nothing prevents a countries, or just as Secretary Lutnick has mentioned, to ask for a renegotiation. So we should be prepared for that. We should be prepared for an aggressive trade policy by the United States. But at the end of the day, I think we have the data to prove that the agreement has worked very well for all three countries, and that all three countries will be able to compete efficiently and effectively against China, for example, if we join forces, if we eliminate barriers between ourselves and not, on the contrary, impose tariffs against the North American partners.
Kenneth, you mentioned China. Let's sort of focus on this for a moment, because there have been accusations within the pundit class that Mexico is giving overseas companies like China a back door into the United States through the trilateral trade deal. How do we address those accusations?
Well, in fact, that has been a position of the U.S. government, not just the Trump administration, but the Biden administration as well, in terms of their concern with transshipment of certain commodities, especially steel and aluminum, arguably coming from China into Mexico, getting mixed in with Mexican production and being exported to the U.S., asking for the tariff preference that the USMCA provides, which of course would be illegal. Now, even though the Mexican government has denied that this is happening, there have been measures taken by Mexico over the last couple of years to try to prevent any issue having to do with transshipment of Chinese goods and would illegally ask for a USMCA preference. For example, there was an increase in MFN tariffs over 550 products, many of which affect directly Chinese exporters. These tariffs were raised substantially. There's quite a bit of coordination between the customs authorities of Mexico and the U.S. to access databases and analyze third country imports into Mexico. Permits for importing products from China that were then identified as being transshipped to the U.S. have been canceled. So the Mexican government has been taking quite a few actions in public policy to prevent any transshipment. And there is a political narrative in the U.S. that is just simply wrong, which claims that there are many Chinese automakers building factories in Mexico, producing cars and exporting to the U.S. There's not a single one that is doing that. But of course, the U.S. concern going forward is on future investments that China might make in Mexico and in Canada. But there are measures being taken, and I think that's going to be a centerpiece of the discussion of the review of 2026. How can North America join forces in preventing unfair trading practices from China and from other regions in the world? There's a lot of cooperation that we can engaging within North America to try to prevent unfair trading practices from affecting the economies of Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
Steve, Kenneth had mentioned lessons learned over the course of the last negotiations. When it comes down to it, what lessons did you learn negotiating CUSMA that would apply to addressing these scattershot tariff announcements we've been getting?
Well, I think the first lesson is really about patience, not reacting too quickly, letting things run their course to some extent. And I think really it's a question of making sure that you play the long game. You don't want to be focused on the initial headlines of a particular day. You want to look at what you want to achieve. And I think when we first had the fentanyl tariffs applied to Canada and Mexico a number of months ago, there was a lot of concern out there. But Canada and Mexico managed to achieve the CUSMA or USMCA exemption for products that met the terms of the agreement. And that allows much of our business to continue as it always has. leaves us with significant problems on steel, aluminum, autos, and some others. But that patience and making sure that we got that exemption has taken us a long ways, and that's how we have to look at it. Not react to every message that comes out.
I totally agree with Steve, because playing the long game, as he says, is the way to address any negotiation. In other words, right now we're in the midst of discussions with the U.S. on the tariff situation, the three main blocks of tariffs that we're facing in North America, the IEEPA tariffs from the issue of immigration, fentanyl, automotive, steel, and aluminum. And basically, the result of that negotiation that's ongoing now between the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. and Canada will undoubtedly impact the review of 2026. So we shouldn't pull the trigger too quickly in trying to appease the U.S. and accept certain measures that, for example, could be very damaging in the long term to our agreement. For example, if we accept, limitations and TRQs, tariff rate quotas on steel, limiting the amount of steel that we can export to the U.S., that would be a de facto violation of the USMCA that we would be accepting. And that could lead us in about 6 months, when we sit down with the U.S. to analyze the future of the USMCA, for the U.S. to ask for TRQs and managed trade, not just on steel and aluminum, but across all products. So what we do now will impact the result of the review in 2026. And so we have to proceed carefully and try to present the arguments that show the U.S. why it makes sense not to have trade barriers between the three North American countries.
So, Kevin, Kenneth and Steve have highlighted the value of patience in these negotiations. Talk to me about tacos and the idea that the president always chickens out. Is that an effective strategy?
Yeah, so that's sort of thrown around the U.S. by his political opponents. And just generally, I think, one, having Kenneth and Steve leading this coalition is of huge value, because they've been there, they've negotiated successfully with the U.S., and I think they're exactly right. When I led the Ways and Means Committee during this U.S.-Mexico-Canada negotiation, the press every day wanted me to weigh in on the president's tweets that morning. But the truth is, I didn't pay attention to his tweets. I paid attention to his campaign promises, because that's what he was calling me about every week. And so I think it's wise to understand he uses social media to wage a very aggressive negotiating style, working to keep people off balance, threatening significant tariffs and barriers to access to the U.S. market. You know, it is part of that negotiating strategy. And I think to the wisdom of having Kenneth and Steve here is to not overreact, but to continue those negotiations and discussions in a positive way. And I think the good news here is that because the president has broadened the issues that he wants to deal with these countries, it also allows countries like Canada and Mexico to bring creative solutions to the table that show why North America matters, why our integration really works, both to the benefits of consumers and job creators. But certainly it's allowed our three countries to weather global recessions better than other regions. It will allow us to compete and win against China if we bring our strengths to the table. And without a doubt, I think those are going to be the conversations in the review. Our hope is, once these existing tariff discussions are settled, the decks are somewhat cleared, hopefully, that'll allow us really to get back to that regular review process, which the White House has said, we'll start as scheduled early in October with a report to Congress in January. And our hope at the end of the day, as a Coalition for North America Trade, is to strengthen and extend the agreement in a very positive way for all three countries.
So then, Kevin, what's more effective? Internal U.S. influence on Washington from groups affected by the uncertainty created by the negotiations, or the Canadian, Mexican negotiators themselves?
Yeah, so both. I would say, Michael, you need that business industry engagement with your own country. As they're doing the negotiations, you need to be able, as a business person or a business leader, being able to lay out the impact and benefits of the current agreement, support that extension, make that case within the country. But the coalition's role is to give them another option, which to share that information across industries to all three countries in a way that creates really the right framework for a positive outcome at the end of the day. So you got to engage with your country. You got to engage with the public to make the case why North America matters, and then engage across three countries as we work as advocates to make sure we get the right agreement at the end of the day.
So, Kenneth, then you're advising using data to demonstrate that the existing trilateral agreement combats unfair trade practices. Who are you talking to when you talk about the importance of data? Because as we know, at the very top in the United States, it's not about facts, it's about feelings. Who are we talking to when we talk about the data that proves this agreement works?
Yeah, well, definitely data works both in terms of the engagement that the private sector needs to have, for example, with the Mexican government, in terms of presenting information as to what sectors are being affected by the tariffs, what are the benefits that have been obtained for all three countries in specific sectors, whether you're talking advanced manufacturing, services, primary agriculture production, or agribusiness, and really taking that information in the case of Mexico to the government and helping them build their negotiating strategy. So with the private sector can definitely help in each one of our countries, providing information as to the reality on the ground, as to what exporters, importers, investors are seeing, and what are the key elements that will help you build a strategy for the negotiation as a government, and also draw your red lines and know exactly what buttons you can push and which ones you have to avoid. But I think one of the main tasks in our coalition, and Chairman Brady alluded to that, is the importance of providing information in all three countries, specifically to private sector participants, to the Congress, to legislators, governors, so that they have the information as to how specifically the agreement is benefiting their communities. So we really have to take the message at the local level. I've always said that trade has to be a grassroots effort, because when you go to the rural Midwest or the Corn Belt in the United States, you have to explain why you would have a major calamity for the regional economy if the Mexican market for U.S. agricultural exports was closed, or why in the northern Midwest, you need inputs from U.S. From Canada and Mexico for the advanced manufacturing industries in automotive, aerospace, machinery and equipment, etc. So getting that data out there, explaining at the local level why these sectors are being benefited by free trade, what kind of employment it's generating, and what are the possibilities of generating more and better paying jobs in the future, that at the end of the day can win the argument, because you can mobilize the private sector to go to their legislators, to go to Washington and explain why they should really preserve the USMCA. At the end of the day, the Coalition for North American Trade is looking to create enough allies, enough critical mass, so that we have a successful review of the agreement, and the agreement gets relaunched for another 16 years as established in the USMCA.
I absolutely agree. As we were whipping votes to secure passage on USMCA and other trade agreements, we always made the case, you win these trade battles at home. And in Texas, we have where I'm from, we have a crucial relationship with Mexico and with Canada. We have almost 1 million jobs tied to this trading relationship. It has benefited us to a great deal, and will even more, I think, going forward. I think it's important for people to understand that American consumers, including in Texas, American businesses and agriculture, large and small, all support this U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. And I would say lawmakers in Congress today support this agreement because it's just so vital for our country. And we believe integrated, we have sort of redesigned our economies to be stronger together. We're going to be driving home that point to policymakers. And we're seeing businesses and lawmakers talking privately with the White House and the Secretary of Commerce and Secretary of Treasury and U.S. Trade Representative's office about what the impact of these tariffs are and how crucial these supply chains are. So the coalition's goal will be to magnify, amplify those arguments, to win this at the local level.
So as our time together comes to a close, Steve, talk to me about dairy supply management, digital rights taxes, things of that nature. How does Canada keep its powder dry? If we negotiate everything away to renew CUSMA, where does that leave us negotiating against these random tariff attacks?
Mm. Well, I think the first consideration goes back to my earlier description of how important patience is, because I think it was important for Canada and Mexico to wait to see what happened between the U.S. and Europe and between the U.S. and Japan, because that's given us some goalposts that we can now look to get beyond, because we want to have more preferential treatment than those two agreements have had, given that we are within a free trade area. So that gives us a bit of a kind of an outer limit of where we would expect to possibly go. But no, we shouldn't absolutely give everything away. And I'm quite confident that the government won't do that. We will try to find some kind of balance and try to focus on areas where we can have some common cause with the U.S. and Mexico. And a lot of that revolves around security. Economic security, supply chain security, energy security, national security. Those are the areas where I think we need to spend a lot more time working on a kind of North American approach to all that. And then from a Canadian perspective, I think we need to do much of what leaders have been talking about. We need to look at diversifying our economy so we're not as vulnerable to what might happen in the U.S. We need to prepare for retaliation if the U.S. takes further actions in the future that may be unexpected. So we do have tools in play, and we certainly have a lot of weight behind all of the resources that we provide to the U.S. But again, we have to be very deliberate about how we play all those cards.
When you think about the trade file, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I have to say two quick things. One is the overall weakening of the rules-based system, because I think that's happening internationally and within North America. That's a big concern. And secondly, the fact that the U.S. is focusing on the economy of the past and China is increasingly focused on the economy of the future. And that's not a good thing for any of us.
Yeah, I would say I think the fairest trade agreements of all are those with as close to zero tariffs as possible and as close to zero barriers as possible. That's exactly what the USMCA is all about. And what I worry about are any changes as we've watched, the White House negotiate agreements for other countries. I think for me, I think it's crucial that we continue to preserve that very free trade, very fair trade, very competitive trade between our two biggest trading partners, by the way, Mexico and Canada, buy 5 times more made in America products than any other country in the world, crucial, frankly, to our economic growth and prosperity. So, yeah, making sure we preserve those key elements is really what keeps me up at night.
What keeps me up at night is the possibility of the 3 leaders in North America somehow forgetting the enormous effort that it took from literally hundreds of thousands of people throughout the years to build the largest free trade area in the world. A economically integrated North America is a stronger North America. And I think that's the objective we should pursue, not just in our Coalition for North American Trade, but in the discussions that go on daily between the 3 governments of Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. and the private sectors. That's an intangible element which is very important. The relationships, the trading relationships and partnerships and strategic alliances that have been built over the years and decades between the 3 private sectors are the backbone of what I hope can lead us to rescue these efforts to maintain the largest free trade area in the world.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time and your insight today.
Thank you,
Thank
Michael.
you. Real pleasure.
Kenneth Smith-Ramos is Mexico's former chief trade negotiator. Kevin Brady is a former chair of the U.S. House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee. And Steve Verhule is Canada's former chief trade negotiator. For further insight into the way forward and the economic and public policy implications of CUSMA renegotiations, visit cdhow.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhow.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.